Hello friends, welcome to the MARE podcast. Before we get started, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Don't forget that you can find more about the MARE project at www.marehamburg.com, and you can support the project and this podcast through Patreon. All the links are in the description. Enjoy! Hello friends, welcome to another episode of the MARE podcast. It's a pleasure to welcome James Hua tonight here with me. Hello James, welcome to the podcast.
Hi everyone, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invite, George.
Oh, of course. I'm sure it will be a great episode. So James is it's at the end of his doctoral studies at the University of Oxford in ancient Greek history, and we'll talk all about his dissertation topic. But before that, he did an MPhil in ancient Greek history at Oxford and a BA in classics at Durham. Correct?
Yep, that's all right.
Okay, my background research is correct then.
Yeah.
And so let's talk a bit about that before we get into the nitty gritty of like what are you doing for your DPhil. So why classics? When did you decide you want to study classics?
Yeah, good question. I guess partly from where I was born and partly from sort of my studies. So I was born in Rome in Italy. So I should say as well, very multicultural. So my mom is Australian, my dad is Chinese, but I was born in Rome in Italy, and I grew up there for 18 years of my life. And somehow I have an Australian accent. I have an American accent, primarily because I went to an international school, hence the American accent. Anyways, but yeah, so definitely growing up in Rome put me in touch with classical culture. You know, every weekend and pretty much at least 2 or 3 times per week, I used to visit archaeological sites.
Wow.
And you know, last Sunday of the month in Italy and also in Greece, I think you get to visit the museums for free. So always made the most of that the whole day. But yeah, so sort of visiting the sites when I was small. I also grew up along the Via Appia, not on the Via Appia itself, but close to it. So there were tons of tomb monuments that I was clambering up as a child. But anyways, yeah, so partly my upbringing, but also I guess my first Latin classes, I would say, or rather my first contact with classics, which was through Latin classes. Somehow I sort of really liked the mathematical nature of Latin and how sort of everything pieced together and how you could think in a very holistic or sort of systematic way. And I really enjoyed that with the Latin literature. And then I guess I'll just say one final thing. Yeah, sort of as teenagers, we always rebel from something. So I rebelled from Latin literature and I went to the Greek side and I went to history. So something much better. Well, history and archaeology. So yeah, that's it.
Okay, yeah. So how is it 3 years at Durham, the BA?
That's right. Yeah. So
How was that?
It was great. 2017 to 2020. Yeah, it was good. I really enjoyed it. The classics faculty there is really strong. And they have really sort of wide ranging, but also sort of cutting edge research interests and teaching topics. You notice the difference very significantly in Oxford now, because here the papers haven't changed since like the 1850s. But in Durham, really sort of whatever professors' research interests were, they integrated that into the standard structure we had. So it was really sort of forward-looking. It was very contemporary in how they approached classics, which I really liked. Yeah, the town itself was lovely. Food not so great, weather also not so great, but the community was lovely, and our classics faculty was right sort of in the center of town.
Absolutely. So did you have to write a thesis for that? You had dissertation at the end?
That's right, yeah.
What was that about?
So I looked at social memory in Thucydides' narrative of the battles and events in Chalkidiki in the north of Greece. So this spans books 4 and 5 of his narrative. And I was looking at how he incorporates the past stories and memories of Olinthos, Patidia, these cities into his narrative.
Okay. Oh, lovely. I think that's connected to your DPhil now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So wait. Okay, we'll get there. So then you come to Oxford for an MPhil in ancient Greek history, and you do. Was it your thesis as well? Something similar? Something along those lines?
Yeah, exactly. So I look at sort of the social memory and the identities that expelled populations form. I looked at 3 case studies for my master's in the classical Greek world. And I guess a lot of my studies or a lot of my cases were from the Chalkidiki as well. So the same geographic.
So you kind of knew what you wanted to do or what interests you, I mean, research-wise from the very start. That's very interesting. Because people, I think, kind of like jump through the topics until they land on something, but you felt laser focused on something. That's very good. So, all right, let's get to the good part then. You're now at the end of your DPhil. And you are looking at, I'm going to give like a general title on population displacement, right, in classical and Hellenistic world. So can you give us kind of an abstract summary of what you're doing more specifically?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm looking at population expulsions and refugee crises in the Archaic and Classical Greek world. So date-wise, that's about 650 to 315 BCE. And geographically, it's really the whole span of the Greek-speaking world. So right from Sicily in the west, sometimes even to the north of France, all the way to the east to sort of the Levant, modern-day Lebanon and so on. So yes, I'm looking at this region, but I'm looking specifically at population expulsions and sort of the displacement of entire cities and regions done in a forcible way. And this is caused by a variety of factors, including sort of natural disasters, which our ancient historians, our ancient sources don't report on as much, but I think were really frequent. But also a lot of wars, civil conflicts, sort of sieges, and so on, which kick out the people of a city, such that the expeller can sort of use the city, appropriate the city, put their own settlers there, and sort of control the territory a bit better. But I guess what I'm doing, first of all, is trying to record all of the cases of mass population expulsion in this time period. So sort of looking at the whole range of evidence, not just historiographical, which past scholarship has really focused on, but also really looking at epigraphy, archaeology, and numismatics, i.e. the evidence that they produce themselves, that the exiles produce, which hasn't been looked at almost at all before. And when we all that evidence, sort of to create a massive, big synoptic database and put that onto a map and look at chronological, diachronic developments, look at regional variations, things like that. So the first sort of full synoptic account of population expulsions in that time. And the second half, and I'll be briefer, is looking at sort of the identities and experiences that these expelled populations form when they're in exile. So in other words, sort of looking at what sort of self-identifications they foreground in the evidence they produce. So especially sort of looking at kinship ties from the past they had, looking at civic ties, re-evoking their old past memories of their polis when they're in exile, but also sort of looking at new types of identities. And I guess one of my big arguments is that I found a new identity of displacement, as I call it, which really foregrounds their past histories of dislocation on every scale, and using that as a sort of rhetoric, as a discourse to create new ties with other polis in a world which was facing so many expulsions. And it's that last point which really marries the two halves together.
All right. So wait. Like,
That
take a
was a
step
lot.
back. You said no. That was excellent. You said that you're looking at the numismatics and the coins they produce.
Yeah.
So if a population is migrating somewhere, why do they produce? Don't they just go to like the local population and inherit their numismatics? Do they produce new ones?
Yeah.
What's going on?
Yeah, this is a really excellent question. And you would think at the outset that, yes, entirely right. Cities, I mean, first of all, when you're expelled and when an invading force comes and kicks you out of a city, you don't, it's done very rapidly. It's sort of brutal and systematic, and you really don't have time to collect your belongings. You don't have time to even get money. If you think about it, a lot of the coin hoards that we have currently were buried because people expected that they were going to leave. So that gives us an indication that they didn't bring their coins and valuables with them. But then, and I'm giving a paper in January on this, but then if you look more closely at the historical sources, such as Diodorus and others, you see many accounts actually of exiles either being allowed to bring money with them, money, cloaks, valuables with them, or actively sort of having a bit more time to leave and then taking these valuables with them. Aside from the historiographical sources, we actually do have about 6 or 7 cases of what are called exile coinages in the classical Greek world. In other words, coins which are from an entirely different city to the one that they're found in, and which we know from the historical sources belong to a polis which had found refuge in that host city. It's fascinating because it raises a whole bunch of questions which which you wouldn't really expect. In other words, I mean, why were there two currencies circulating at the same time? How did they operate? Did the host city even really accept them? Who was dealing with them? If people were if people were sharing and using these coins between the exiled community itself, does this imply that there was some sort of community between themselves? What sort of identities does it tell about them? What are they doing with it? So it raises a whole bunch of questions, which I explore in a paper further, but it's a fascinating case. And there have been sort of 6 to 7 confirmed cases. So it seems to be more widespread than we think.
Okay. Wow, that's amazing. So, okay, so thinking of numismatics, I'm also thinking of iconography and the art in general. So, do you see that the people who move try to make their art look like their host city, or do they try to differentiate themselves from it?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So I gave another paper on this. But
Uh
yes,
huh.
I think this was back in 3 weeks ago in Oxford for the archaeology seminar, which is inconveniently named a name which shall not be named. But
Yeah, that's not
um,
much.
yes. So in terms of the visual representations that we have, so there's a variety of sources in which they actually depict themselves during their times of exiles, and so we could equate this as self-representations as refugees. But most of the representations really are not that dissimilar to what normal citizens in a polis which is still rooted and which hasn't been uprooted look like. So in other words, we have, for example, the Plataeans, we have the Samians in Athens, who we know were exiles and kicked out by Sparta and various other powers, who used exactly the same iconography that Athens uses in its gravestones, in its decrees and official documents. So in some cases, it's just nothing changes. But then if you look a little closer, you start to see some elements being added. And where I've noticed this is especially in the numismatic iconography, so the depictions on coins and how they're shown. There's a nice case of Odysseus appearing, and obviously Odysseus is the hero par excellence of dislocation. Um, and there's sort of a whole bunch of other cases of sort of grief being woven into these representations, but specifically relating to myths of past people who had been exiled, Heracles, so on and so forth. And there's sort of other elements of this location as well, referencing past expulsions. So just to give one last example, in Troezen, for example, in the Peloponnese, we have a nice a really fascinating statue group of the displaced Athenians in 480. And apparently, Pausanias tells us that there was this whole statue group, like a large one, of the women and children who had fled there. And it's just, it raises a question like, how on earth did they represent them? Because we don't have any parallels from what I know of in the Greek world. And it's just so fascinating. And it entirely disrupts the iconography that we have of usual, rooted citizens and so on. So I think it's a mixture. I think, what I was talking about just now about the identity of refugees and representing people as refugees is far less frequent. We can't deny that. But I think it's really interesting that they do this.
Okay, so if we're talking about statues, I imagine like big statue groups would cost a lot of money to be set up, right?
Yeah.
So is this like a political statement, kind of like we're here to stay, or is it a monument to, I don't know, the struggles? What
Yeah.
is it?
Okay, this is a really good question, and this is also a question which which I've been facing in my thesis a lot and in my research, in which people ask. But yeah, sort of where do these exiles get the money to create these massive monuments from? Um, and I'm sorry, could you repeat the question again? It just slipped my mind.
Don't worry. It's like it's okay. It costs a lot of money. Is it like it's a political statement
Oh,
of kind of we're here, or is it a kind of monument to our struggles? But
mm,
who's the target audience? Maybe that's the correct way to put it.
perfect. Yeah, exactly. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Sorry, my bad. Yes. Basically, so the logic behind this, or what scholars usually argue, is that if you put up a monument representing yourself when you're in exile, um, as you say, sort of it implies a degree of permanentness and of rootedness and of staying in that location. So if refugees put this a monument of themselves up, it suggests that they're going to stay there and that they're going to be perpetual refugees, or perhaps they've been integrated into their host community, or they've lost their old identity. We do have a few cases of this, mainly in tombstones. But what's really interesting is that actually this is very rare. We don't actually have a lot of evidence by exiles produced when they're in exile. A lot of it, as I've given in another talk, a lot of it
Mhm.
sort of appears when they're back at home. So it's retrospective in many cases. When they're repatriated, there's lots of cases of this, more than we frequently realize. They put up memories and sort of monuments about their past. And sort of, yeah, they reframe their civic identities and their past civic memories based on this experience of expulsion. Um, so when they're in exile, I mean, yeah, it could be read as a conscious choice in that sort of they don't want to represent themselves as refugees. They don't want to represent themselves as being politically inexistent, as sort of not having an identity, being effectively worthless in the Greek world, which is defined by polis. Or, as every ancient historian and archaeologist knows, we simply have lost the evidence, which is very possible, of course.
Oh yeah.
But thank you for that. Okay, this is a really good question, and this is the first time that I've tried to formulate it off the top of my head. But it's a really hard one, and it's true, sort of.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, I'm glad. I'm glad I'm making the right question. I'm doing the right questions. I mean, you're obviously presenting it nicely, so like it prompts the right questions in my head. So, okay, do you separate between exiles who were exiled because of natural disasters and exiles that were exiled because of war and forced displacement?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, did you want to add something?
Do you have to say
Oh,
something about that? Is it
no,
like a yes or no?
oh, okay, this is another very good question. So okay, I'll start my answer by saying, first of all, so we have far fewer cases of attested cases, anyways, of expulsions caused by natural disasters, and I think this is really a bias of the sources, in that so the sources like the historians, sometimes the epigraphy, they do mention that natural disasters come and affect a population, but often they really emphasize that the whole population is destroyed. Everyone dies, the city's engulfed in the earth, and Zeus is happy, or sort of Poseidon's happy, he engulfs the town and everyone dies. So in that case, obviously, I mean, the only population expulsion that happens is to the underworld. So I don't consider them, unfortunately. But I think this is precisely the point. It's sort of a literary trope in order to exaggerate the mass destruction as caused by a god and by a divine force. So I think actually, if we look more closely, especially, there's a few cases in the numismatic evidence, but more in the epigraphy, and actually in the archaeology, really, because we see sort of cities being, or rather, let me rephrase, we see nearby sites to cities that we know were destroyed by natural disasters. We see those reviving or sort of appearing quite rapidly after the expulsion caused by natural disasters occurred. And we can date this by pottery quite securely. So basically, yes. So it seems that population expulsions by natural disasters happen much more frequently than we realize. And maybe even as much as expulsions caused by war and so on. And I'll say one more thing. This is certainly the case in the modern world, where in fact, I think it's 60, I think it's around 60, maybe 65% of all internally displaced peoples, since like 2023, are caused by natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, forest fires, a whole bunch of things. Now, sorry, to get to your question after my long prelude, whether these exiles depict themselves differently, whether exiles from natural disasters depict themselves differently to those by war, very good question. My inclination here is, it's a hard question, and I think lack of evidence sort of inhibits us a little bit. But I think in this case, it ultimately depends on the sort of the amount of people that existed to produce the evidence, if that makes sense. So in other words, natural disasters, okay, it is true they tend to destroy people more than when a population is allowed to leave during war or when it flees during war. I mean, various cases, but anyways. So the expelled population caused by the natural disaster, since they're fewer in number, they sort of produce less evidence, so we have less as a result from those natural disasters. Yeah, it doesn't really answer your question, does it? But
no, it does, absolutely does. So, okay, so how did you? Okay, wait. So to study these people in classical and Hellenistic Greece, did you first read the sources, the ancient sources, and then go through that to like they were displaced? Do the sources say, oh, the people were displaced here, and you go and look at the material world of X place? And did you, like, after doing that, did you kind of like were able to identify this location which was not written in the sources?
Yeah, really interesting point. Yeah, so my main starting point with the evidence, with the primary sources, was looking at the historians and historiography, mainly because that's just the most abundant evidence. So my approach here was, I mean, it was a variety, but especially was to look at key terms for expulsion in the Greek sources, such as fevgo, ekballo, ekpipto, so on. And then sort of, do whole word searches in all of our extant Greek corpus of historians and other sources, and see which ones are relevant to mass expulsion as opposed to sort of individual exiles and so on, and create a map of that. And then exactly, you're right, sort of from the cases of exiles, looking at the places that they're mentioned in the historical sources, And it's not actually very frequent when they do mention the places to which they flee. Often, in fact, the historical sources are very disinterested in the refugees themselves. So the moment that they're kicked out, they sort of entirely lose track of them. They lose interest in them. They're not interested in people who are displaced or who aren't associated to a polis, because just in a Greek world where the polis is so important, they don't care. When we do have references to the people being expelled and fleeing to a particular place, then yes, I looked at the numismatic evidence, the epigraphic evidence, especially new ones, new publications from those places, which are obviously in epigraphy presented in SCG, in BE, and so on, numismatics in Numismatic Chronicle, and so on, and various resources. And yeah, I just had a little browse. And I was very lucky in that more sources than you would realize actually relate to exiles in the classical period, especially in the 4th century. So yes, that was my approach anyways, sort of trying to look at especially looking beyond historiography and looking at epigraphy, numismatics, archaeology, and trying to look for their presences of these exiles. Not always the easiest space, as you can see that as I'm struggling to answer here, but yeah.
No, I mean, I'd imagine that doesn't sound easy. But okay, let's nerd out a bit about languages. So do you search the epigraphy by words, or do you search for like different dialects that shouldn't be there, or like different ways of forming a phrase, or how do you detect that on the epigraphy?
That's a really good point. So in terms of dialects and looking for different dialects, and in fact, so Nino Luragi and various other people have written beautifully about this, but the use of a different dialect by people of another polis is a very powerful tool in terms of identity. That said, it doesn't always necessarily correlate to mass expelled populations. It could just be an individual exile going abroad, for example, for economic reasons. Economic migrants could be anyone really. But I have found at least, I think, 4 cases in which people use a different dialect, but specifically to like make, when they're defining themselves as being from a particular polis, which had been expelled, or sort of naming their father or other traits about their identity, about sort of the things they practice, the musical instruments they play, for example, especially with the Thebans, where they use the particular dialect to distinguish themselves. And that seems to be a more conscious choice rather than sort of not knowing how to write in the dialect of the host city.
It's okay. Interesting. So do you see people when they're forcefully displaced move to the next city, or is it just I move to the richest city I could get access to because there's more chances of me surviving or living a better life there?
Yeah. Again, I preface all my questions by saying this is a really good question, and my answers by saying this is a good question. But anyways, no, these are really great. Yes, so it's a mixture. So I would say there's 2 trends we see here. First of all, what we really see is related to their survival. In other words, when a population is expelled, what we see is a lot of surrounding sites in the Hora specifically, in the surrounding hinterland or whatever we want to countryside, being populated all of a sudden quite shortly after the expulsion happened. And we see this is sort of a trend which is becoming much more apparent in recent excavations and years. The best regions where we see this is Sicily, especially with, well, Sicily and Asia Minor. So in Sicily, we see really when the Carthaginians, for example, come and expel the people of Gela, we see lots of farmsteads in the vicinity, 20 kilometers away, 10 kilometers away, even 5 kilometers away, not that far, suddenly having this pottery. And it's like, why is there pottery here? Why is there human activity here? Since it was abandoned a long time ago, we can tell. And it appears because a lot of the inhabitants do move to these areas where we know the expelling powers won't come and sort of kick them out, won't have access to them because they don't know the local surroundings. So basically, yes, it's sort of having limited resources, so they just go to safe places that they know they can find refuge in safely. And then, give it maybe a few months, even a few years, they return back to the city. So what we often see is sort of rehabilitation and repopulation quite rapidly after the historical sources say an entire city is destroyed. So that's one phenomenon, sort of moving to the nearby site and then coming back. The other phenomenon we see is actually quite much more distant movement, but to places where the expelled polis had various forms of political ties with before, political, social ties, so on. So I've noticed a lot of economic ties. So refugees will often go to places that in the past they had trading links with. I've noticed political ties, ties where they had philia before or where they fought in the same military. They go to that city that they had ties, pre-existing relations with. And since they had those good relations, they could get greater privileges, greater benefits at no cost or sort of at a lesser cost, and therefore just survive more easily, really. There was no real established framework. There was nothing like sort of non-governmental organization, nothing like UNHCR or the United Nations, who had a framework, obviously, to provide them food unconditionally or provide them aid unconditionally. They had to tap into pre-existing networks that they had.
Very, very interesting. Okay, so today, refugees are a big topic.
Yeah.
Let's say like it's a big talk in our day. So, are there any lessons learned from antiquity about how to handle or not handle these situations today about displacement of people?
Yeah. So this is the perennial question, right? How far can we read? I mean, all of our studies are obviously influenced by our modern lenses and by what's happening today. So that's perfectly valid. But especially in this very topical and sort of hotly debated region, to what extent are is the ancient phenomenon similar to the modern, and to what extent are we valid in sort of reading with our modern lenses onto what was happening in the ancient world, and how do we know we're not distorting what was happening back then? I think there actually are a lot of similarities. I mean, there's clear differences. So especially, for example, let me just pick out one with the gender aspect. At least in the historians, but also in the epigraphy and really throughout the ancient evidence, the ancient phenomenon seems to mainly concern women and younger children, and sometimes the elderly. So really, it was a very sort of refugees were really, yeah, more skewed towards women and younger children, as opposed to today, where data from UNHCR and other refugees agencies are showing that it seems to be a much more split balance. And sort of expulsions seem to be much higher number now. Anyways, but yes, but then there's a lot of similarities as well, and I think the biggest similarity that I want to draw out, and this is really a big lesson, is actually the resilience that expelled populations show in the ancient Greek world. The fact that they can bounce back so quickly, and that they're able to sort of move to these, as I said, nearby sites, to find ways to survive. But also the amount of evidence that they produce when they're in exile, and the ways they're able to form new communities, new societies, and sort of the ties they tap into, but also remold and sort of rework based on the theme of expulsion and dislocation that these ancient exiles do. I think that's a really valuable lesson for how we can approach strategies and practices of refugee integration in modern societies in Europe today, and how sort of, how we as host cities and others can try to appeal to or try to be a bit more welcoming towards these refugees, trying to listen to their voices and trying to trying to find commonalities and links with them, rather than just being like, oh, you need to, follow our society and our structure, and, if you don't do what we do, then you're not welcome at all. I think we have to be much more generous and sort of understand that these people have undergone horrific suffering, both in the ancient world and the modern world. We just need to be a bit more generous and, open-minded towards them.
Yeah. No, that was beautiful. Okay. One last thing there.
Mm-hmm.
Identity of displacement.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk to us a bit more about it? How do you describe it? Where do you see it? How did you come up with this concept?
Oof, okay, big question. I guess the final chapter of my thesis, chapter 8, is really concerned with. So I noticed this a lot with the expelled populations themselves. So they foreground this. I'll get to in a second what I mean. But then I notice sort of it permeates the entire Greek world, and that we see Athens, Sparta, and other ones, and other major powers, especially in the 4th century, evoking this new identity of displacement and rewriting their civic ties based on it. So in other words, they really re-emphasize their past experiences of mass expulsion, obviously with Athens in 480, earlier, well, no, not really early, but in 480, in 404, when the oligarchic coup happens and the Democrats have to leave to the Piraeus and Phyle and elsewhere. Anyways, so the question is like, why, I mean, especially with Athens itself, which I forgot to mention was actually the highest expeller of all the places. So how did we get from Athens in the 5th century, which kicked out everyone in the Greek world, to the, already by the mid 4th century, 50 years later, they're creating new links with refugees, and they're showing themselves as refugees or their past as being refugees. How does that happen? So that's why it's so appealing. In terms of what I mean by, and I'll leave in that cliff note because I'll read my thesis to find the answer. But anyways, in terms of what I mean by identity of displacement, two things I would say. First of all, it's a process of sort of re-evoking civic ties and re-evoking your past policies, memories, and institutions, but reframing it through the themes of dislocation. And this can be through sort of looking at past expulsions and sort of evoking them a bit more strongly in these civic identifications, or it can be through sort of creating ties or emphasizing ties with other expelled populations who you gave aid to in the past and so on. So that's one form, rewriting expulsion into their civic identities. And the other one is really sort of, the other aspect of it is sort of creating, I mean, it's sort of similar to the last point I said, but sort of creating ties with whole regions or whole groups of cities which had been expelled. So on a much more sort of international, not international, perhaps regional level, creating or selecting cities which had been expelled very specifically to create ties with and make a very political statement that you're identifying with them.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So what's next for you then? What's next year hold for you?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll have to submit it, the thesis,
Yeah.
probably in the next week or so. And then, yes, I'll be doing a bit of teaching until December, and then I have a postdoc in Athens at the British School, which I was very fortunate to get for about a year. Well, I'll be expanding this topic and subject into the Hellenistic world, so looking at mass expulsions in the Hellenistic world, again creating a large database and comparing it and sort of expanding in scope a bit and sort of comparing it to other forms of mobilities, not all forcible, but to see sort of, to really make more precise the particularities of forcible mass expulsion. Why is it so special? And perhaps understand, as I've been noticing more now, actually mass expulsion and forced expulsion is not so different from other forms of mobility. In fact, we should, I really think, conceptualize the world, the ancient world, as one of mobility of different varieties of forcibility.
Wow. Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for talking to me and for sharing all that. Best of luck with your submission. I'm sure it'll be great, but best of luck. Hope everything goes the way you want it to. And thank you everyone for listening. Do you have any closing remarks for the episode?
No, I would just say that this was actually, we could almost say, an excellent mock Viva interview. You genuinely asked the hardest questions that I've been fearing the most. So I'm glad you asked and gave me the opportunity to formulate them in my mind to everyone. So I'm really grateful. Thank you. No, genuinely.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad. I'm glad and grateful that I helped you. Hope you, I don't know, hope you get the same questions in your Viva. It'll be very cool, actually. That shows I'm ready to be an assessor. I'm not a second-year DPhil. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for listening to another episode of the M.A.R.E podcast, and I'll see you all next time.